I want to start this talk with a quote from St. Paul, the beginning of his letter to the Colossians. We always thank God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, when we pray for you, because we have heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love which you have for all the saints, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven. Of this you have heard before in the word of truth, the gospel which has come among you, as indeed in the whole world it is bearing fruit and growing, so among yourselves, from the day you heard and understood the grace of God in truth. So I want to start with this text. It applies, in my mind, in a lot of ways to Immaculata Academy and to my whole experience in this Catholic liberal arts renewal that's been going on for quite a while. So, first of all, St. Paul begins many of his letters this way. I thank God for you in my prayers. I thank God for the Christian community that you are. And I share his feeling. I've been visiting schools like Immaculata Academy since about 2006. And almost all the time when I visit the schools, I come away so encouraged. It's such a beautiful experience. It was so wonderful to be here today, to see the joy and the commitment and the learning in your teachers, and the commitment in the administration, the excitement and joy in learning among the students. That's one of the most beautiful things to experience here. So I thank God. I'd heard about Immaculata Academy for quite a while, not a lot of details. But I kind of felt like I knew what to expect because I've seen it in many other areas of the country. Still, you kind of blew me away. Like, what's going on here is really top end among all the schools that I visited. Another thing I want to point out here in what St. Paul says is he says that I've heard of your faith and your love because of the hope you have, the hope that is laid up for you in heaven. So what's striking there to me is it's hope that he sees as a buttress for the faith and the love that are at work among the Colossians. And that's going to be a main theme of this talk is hope as the buttress for faith and love. And so thinking about that, and certainly visiting schools like Immaculata Academy give me a lot of hope for both Catholic education and its future and for the future of the church. Now, after starting with Scripture, it's always appropriate to go to Tolkien. Okay, and I'm pretty serious about that. Tolkien is our Homer, but that's another talk. I can go into that at some point. But so I'm going to go to Tolkien. And this is, and the books, not the movies, the books. And there's a point in the Fellowship of the Ring where Frodo climbs up to the top of Amon Hen, which is this hill of seeing, and he looks out and he can see everything that's going on in the whole of their region of Middle Earth, and he sees wars and the preparation for war going on. And it says, all the power of the Dark Lord was in motion. Then turning south again, he beheld Minas Tirith. Who doesn't know what Minas Tirith is? I'm sure you're embarrassed to say. Okay, Minas Tirith is the chief city of Gondor, which is the great bulwark against the great foe of the Dark Lord Sauron, the enemy. So he beheld Minas Tirith. Far away it seemed and beautiful, white-walled, many-towered, proud and fair upon its mountain seat. Its battlements glittered with steel, and its turrets were bright with many banners. Hope leaped in his heart at seeing the beauty of Minas Tirith and its strength. And that's certainly the kind of thing I experience when I come to a school like Immaculata. The beauty, the strength of the Catholic traditions here makes hope leap up in my heart. But then it goes on. But against Minas Tirith was set another fortress, greater and more strong. Thither eastward his eye was unwillingly drawn. It passed the ruined bridges of Osgiliath, the grinning gates of Minas Morgul and the haunted mountains, and it looked upon Gorgoroth, the valley of terror in the land of Mordor. Darkness lay there under the sun. Fire glowed amid the smoke. Mount Doom was burning and a great reek rising. Then at last his gaze was held, wall upon wall, battlement upon battlement, black, immeasurably strong, mountain of iron, gate of steel, tower of adamant. He saw it. Barad-dûr, the fortress of Sauron. All hope left him. And I think that at least for us adults anyway, you can often feel that way. This is such a beautiful thing. But then if you pay attention to the news and you hear what's going on in the world outside, it can seem overwhelmingly black. And how can we ever really overcome the enemy that's arrayed against us? Back when I first started getting involved with ICLE and this work of Catholic Education Renewal, it was back in 2005. There were some schools to visit then. My experience was somewhat like Frodo's, but a little bit different. I would experience this enormous joy at seeing the delightful education going on in the schools. And then I'd walk out and I would get this tremendous sadness that less than 1%, much less than 1% of all the children in America and of all the children in the world were experiencing education as a joyful, fulfilling experience. That sort of thing can lead to discouragement, even despair. And if you pay attention to the news about Catholic education, it almost always leads with, back in 1960, there were 5 million Catholic students enrolled in Catholic schools. There were 13 or 14,000 schools. Now we're down to 1.7 million, and we're at 6,000 schools, and more are closing all the time. It can be very discouraging, and it can lead to despair about Catholic education. Why don't we just give it up? Why do we continue to pour all this money and time into it when it doesn't seem to be a thriving enterprise? It doesn't even seem that Catholic education is grounding students in their faith and in their experience of Catholic life enough so that they don't leave their faith when they go to college or go out into the world. So there are many bishops who feel that, and pastors who feel that a Catholic school is an albatross around their neck. They would rather just have them close, turn into charter schools or something like that. And this is really happening. So that can get very discouraging. But Christian hope is not an emotion. Hope can name an emotion, but when we talk about Christian hope, this is a theological virtue. Our hope is not based upon something we see that excites us or gives us confidence. Our hope is based upon the power of God, the power of the Holy Spirit. And we know that the power of God will lead us to victory. We know that the power of God is always at work in the world, always bringing about renewal. So we never have a reason that should lead us to despair. And we should always think about that and rest upon the power of God as we face the difficulties ahead of us. But grace does build on nature. So it's much easier to live the theological virtue of hope if you actually see things that are hopeful, if you participate in what's hopeful. When you read Ecclesiastes, Qoheleth, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, or you read Job, we've been reading through Job in the last few weeks in the liturgy, the Mass. When you read them, these are men who have hope, but that's all they have is the theological virtue of hope. Everything else looks really bad. And so it's an excruciating experience for them to continue to hope amid the darkness that they see all around them. So when we actually see and experience things like Immaculata Academy, like a parish that's really living a full and joyful experience of Catholic life, Catholic sacramental life. When we see the saints in our midst, when I was younger, Pope John Paul II and Mother Teresa, those were lights to the world, and they gave you hope in spite of you don't see that all the time, but because they were such public figures, it really gave me a lot of hope and conviction about my faith. So when we see and understand, when we see beautiful examples and we kind of understand and look back at the history of the church, and we see how the church has always gone through dark times and then come out stronger and more beautiful again. Everybody keeps expecting the church to die. People want it to be killed. It won't be killed, and it turns out stronger in the long run than any of its enemies. That really strengthens our hope. So I'm going to bring in another wise man after St. Paul and J.R.R. Tolkien. We're now going to go to Christopher Dawson. Now, probably most of you have not heard of Christopher Dawson, but he was alive in England about the same time as J.R.R. Tolkien, and he was a great Catholic social historian. So he was an amazing historian. He was also a sociologist who brought insights from the science of sociology to the study of the development of culture and the history of culture. So he has in a book of his called The Historical Reality of Christian Culture, and some of these things are on your sheet. The sheet is more, you don't have to follow along, but Justin assured me we were going to have intense discussion for a long time afterwards, so you'll be able to refer to that, and we can refer to that as we go along. Christopher Dawson, in that Historical Reality of Christian Culture book, saw 6 ages of the church, 6 historical ages of the church. And he saw a pattern in them. Each of them, he said, begins and ends in crisis. First, there is a period of intense spiritual activity when the church is faced with a new historical situation and begins a new apostolate. Secondly, there is a period of achievement when the church seems to have conquered the world and is able to create a new Christian culture and new forms of life and thought and art. Thirdly, there is a period of retreat when the church is attacked by enemies from within and without, and the achievements of the second phase are lost or depreciated. And if we look at both the recent history of Catholic education and the more remote history of Catholic education, I think that you see this played out. And I'm going to be talking about that a little bit in this talk. What I want to convey to you is my conviction that through the work of schools like Immaculata Academy and other initiatives that have gone on from the middle part of the 20th century, we're definitely we're beginning a new apostolate in Catholic education, and we're also creating now more and more successfully these new forms of education which are going to conquer the world. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. I want to start this part of the talk by just sharing with you some of my personal story, both because it sort of interweaves with education, the recovery of education, with Catholic education, and that also will provide. There's a lot of things that we could talk about in the discussion period that you can go to. So I was raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. I went to a public high school called Walnut Hills High School. It was a college prep school. And back then, what I didn't realize at the time, had never heard of classical education or anything, but Walnut Hills had the remnants of a classical education still in the 70s and early 80s. I went there from 8th grade to 12th grade. I did 5 years of Latin. 3 years were mandatory for everybody at that school, and these are the ones that are going to go on to college. I did ancient mythology, ancient and medieval history, great literature all the time. We learned to study and discuss great literature. So but I also saw kind of the doom coming, the doom that most places had already experienced in terms of classical education, and which Walnut Hills would soon experience, which was that math and science were not were modern, completely modern and not very different from other schools. And in the end, shortly after I left, Walnut Hills went from being a classical school to a school for engineering trainers, for training engineering. And that's basically what happened to classical education from the late 19th century up until our time, was that the classical education traditions were driven out by the introduction and domination of the mathematics and science side of things. After Walnut Hills High School, I went to Thomas Aquinas College, which is a college, Catholic liberal arts college in California. Being from Ohio, I thought California is the land of fruits and nuts, and it was. But where sin abounds, grace does more abound. When I arrived there as a 15 or 16-year-old junior, it was literally a pasture land with trailers on it. That was the college. There was a student in my class who was supposed to be in my class, and her parents kind of drove up and looked at it and drove right away. Like, no, not sending our kids here. But for me, it was an amazing experience. It was, Thomas Aquinas College offers a fully integrated program in Catholic liberal education. So everybody there has to take 4 years of theology, 4 years of philosophy, 4 years of literature and history, 4 years of math, 4 years of science, 2 years of language theory, a year of music theory. And all of the tutors, they call them tutors, all of the professors there have to learn to teach in every area of the curriculum. So you don't come there as a specialist and teach in your specialty. You are there as a leading learner for all of your classes. It was also fully Catholic, and it ordered its whole program under the light of the Catholic faith. It was a great books program in that we didn't use textbooks. We used original texts, and our classes were all discussion. The tutor would ask a question. I guess you guys do the Socratic discussion, right? I saw the 5th grade today getting their first taste of it and really doing an excellent job. And your teacher, all right, Santoro, thank you, Ms. Santoro. She was an excellent leader of that. Well, that was really what attracted me to the college. I just thought, wow, here's a place we're going to read great books and I get to talk in class. That's all I care about. But it was so much more than that, and it really had a deep formative impact on me. After that, I went to the Institute for Medieval Studies in Toronto, which I went there to study theology. I wanted to study St. Thomas Aquinas in theology. But this was founded by a man named Etienne Gilson, who's very famous in the Catholic Thomist revival of the early 20th century. And he founded it because he had a conviction that if you're going to study any area of thought in medieval life, you have to study every area of thought in medieval life, because all of its theology and philosophy, its literature, everything came out of this deep Catholic light, deep Catholic ways of thought that permeated everything. So if you want to understand St. Thomas Aquinas, you have to know that he was a Benedictine, that he was raised as a Benedictine. He was intended to become the abbot of Monte Cassino. So that was where his education was living with the Benedictines. And then he went to the Dominicans. And you have to understand what it was like to be a Dominican. You have to know what chant was like, because St. Thomas Aquinas wrote some of our most beautiful Eucharistic chants. So you need to see all of this, as well as understand the history of thought that was going on. So that was a conviction. So the first year was just having education. I got survey courses in every area of medieval culture. So among other things, I got to do canon law and art and architecture, archaeology, vernacular literature. It was the first time I read Beowulf. It was a wonderful experience. Then I went on to do my specialty area in St. Thomas. Then I came back to teach at Thomas Aquinas College, and I was there for 30 years. And at the end of my 29th year, I finished teaching my first year of senior theology on the Trinity and the Sacraments and the Incarnation. And then I realized at the end, I've finished the program. So I had taught every single class in the curriculum, which was just this amazing experience of thinking about how all these areas of thought and culture and beauty interact with one another. It was also a great thing for me as a tutor that my life was, I've got these questions. I've read this book, I got these questions. I'm going to ask these eager young students my questions and have them talk about it for me, and I'll learn from them. And then I'll guide them in the ways I want them to go. Well, it'll be good for them too, I think. But so as a lifelong learner, this was a tremendous experience. Then, while I was there, I'd been there, this has been 2005, so I was there about 13 years. I reread Ex Corde Ecclesiae, and this is Pope John Paul II's document that he wrote to the Catholic universities. And at the time when he wrote it, it got a lot of press because the Catholic universities were up in arms that he was insisting that Catholic universities be Catholic. How dare he? And at Thomas Aquinas College, we didn't have to worry about that. So I didn't really pay attention to it the first time. The second time I reread it though, and I said, he also says they should reform themselves as universities. They need to be committed to the truth for its own sake, above all. That's much more important than any products that might come from it. And they need to be fully integrated at their core. The universities have to have at their core an understanding of theology, philosophy, and all these areas that you see in Benedict. If you read Pope Benedict, there's a guy who understands it all in the light of faith. That has to be at the core of every Catholic university, every university. So I thought that's what we do at TAC. I guess the church wants us to help. So I took that as a personal call. I said, the church wants an Institute for Catholic Liberal Education. And I went to my friend Michael Van Hecke, who was the headmaster of St. Augustine. He knew the K-12 world. I didn't know that very well. And I said, hey, Mike, the church wants an Institute for Catholic Liberal Education. And he said, I already have it. So I didn't know this, but he actually had a 501c3 tax-deductible organization called the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education. So it's like, woo! There you go. I was right. God wants this. So then it began my work with ICLE, and I became the first executive director. And that was when I started tromping around the country. I never wanted to leave my Catholic shire. My wife and I, our desire was always to be boring, absolutely boring. But there you go. You end up tromping around the country and getting to see all these things. Now, it's a beautiful thing because then I got to meet so many wonderful Catholics, so many people involved in Catholic education that have been really ennobling and inspiring to me. But there you go. If you turn yourself over to God, you never know where he's going to take you. Aslan is not a tame lion, as they say. So then we got going there. Now let me just pick up a little bit with the story of the Catholic Liberal Arts Renewal, which was kind of beginning in the 80s. And one of the most remarkable things about this story is that now there are many starts to it. I'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. But it's really amazing that it all started with Dorothy Sayers. Dorothy Sayers was an Oxford medievalist, translated Dante. She wrote mystery stories. Well, she gave this talk one time at Oxford called The Lost Tools of Learning. And she says, we should go back and look at what they did in the Middle Ages and use it to reform education today. And she said, nobody's going to listen to me. Who am I? I'm no educator, right? And nobody did listen to her until like 1977 in America. The National Review republished that a few times. And parents who were starting to say to themselves, I cannot send my kids to the schools. They're going to lose their faith. They're going to lose their morality. They're not going to get any education at all. I guess I better do it myself. And they read Dorothy Sayers' talk, which was short. You know, Americans, we like short, we like very practical things, good recommendations. They said, wow, here it is. So Dorothy Sayers became a blueprint for many American parents, Catholic, non-Catholic Christian, non-Christian. A lot of people said, okay, we can do this. And they started using the American genius to figure out, how can we do this? We want the best for our kids. How can we bring it about? Is there anybody out there who's doing it? Can we connect? Can we learn from you? All of that went on, and it just bore more and more and more fruit. And I've said this a couple times to the faculty already, but this is an American phenomenon that the rest of the world is learning from us now about how to educate, which is an amazing thing. God is using our American genius for his own purposes. So then the next part of the story would be, that's going on. ICLE comes into existence at, I'll just do a couple of pictures here. You can see here, that's old Thomas Aquinas College with Ron MacArthur, the president, up in the right corner. And on the left is the first ICLE conference. So in 2013, we had our first conference, which we called a Catholic Classical Schools Conference. And there were 70 people there. I was sort of apologizing to people, you're going to come all the way across the country, and there are only going to be 70 people there. But they were so jazzed to find out there were 70 people around the country who are as crazy as I am. That's incredible. And it was such a shot in the arm. And then every year this conference has grown. We're now well over 400. We expect 500 next year in Lincoln, Nebraska. We have now superintendents and bishops who are partaking in this. We are doing it in this country. We are doing it in other parts of the world. And there are other organizations that are also part of this renewal. So also at that time, you want to hit it again. So we have the Dorothy Sayers, 1947. In the mid-90s, that's Laura Berquist, who was the founder of Mother of Divine Grace. We also had like Seton Academy and Colby Academy getting going at that time. 2007, the Holy See's teaching on Catholic schools. Archbishop Michael Miller, who was the Secretary of Education, Secretary for the Congregation of Education in the Vatican, put together a short summary. Again, Americans love something short and concise and practical. He put together the church's teachings on education into the little brown book, which is about 60 pages, and he gave us 5 marks of Catholic education. And that's like the marching orders, to say what we're doing is not just because we think it's a good idea. What we're doing is something the church wants. And so we're doing this as a Catholic apostolate. And then we had then St. Jerome Academy, 2010. St. Jerome Academy was the first parochial school, and this is only 14 years ago, the first parochial school to embrace a Catholic classical liberal arts education. That's a great story too, I won't go into it, but they ended up writing what they call the St. Jerome Academy Educational Plan, which is the deepest, best thought through, kind of amazing document for grounding a school in a full vision of Catholic education. So all those things are happening together. And we had our conference in 2013. So God gave us all those tools along with the internet, which allowed me to run this organization. So where is ICLE? And I said, here, it's in my phone. We were able to bring this about. And now, one of the things on your handout is part of a proposal that was recently given to the USCCB. And I'm not going to read from it, but if you look at it, you might see marks of St. Jerome Academy all over it. This is a proposal put together for the bishops by Mary Pat Donahue, who's the executive secretary to the Bishops' Committee on Education. Well, Mary Pat Donahue was actually the principal who was the one who led the renewal of St. Jerome Academy. And she became our first director of schools at ICLE before she went on to the USCCB. So the bishops and the superintendents are really noticing this, and more of them are wanting to reproduce the kind of thing that you have going on here in their dioceses and their schools. Okay. Let's see, hit it one more time. Yeah, so this is around the world. Brazil's going nuts now in the Catholic schools sprouting up independently of the government. And we work closely with a group in Colombia and Costa Rica and Peru. That's the Netherlands. We're teaching the quadrivium to the Netherlands. This is my Boethius Institute work. But I get to go to Leiden in the Netherlands now for a week every year, which is kind of nice. So it's really spreading. Now, so this is all hope. This really, I mean, it makes me, I've had a front row seat to one of the actions of providence, one of the actions of the Holy Spirit. So it's very real to me now. But it's also what I say about hope, that hope as a virtue is not just like something I want. Oftentimes a sense of, oh, I wish I could have it, but I really can't. Hope is love, but it's love in the face of difficulties. Love in the face of difficulties that doesn't give up and really has confidence that in spite of the difficulties, the end will be achieved. So I want to talk just a little bit about the difficulties, some of the difficulties in this renewal. A major difficulty in the classical liberal arts renewal is that the old, so it's classical, one of the things about what's classical is it's old. What's old has been forgotten, like totally forgotten. So in that quote from Christopher Dawson, he says, when the third phase of anything is the third phase of an age, in that phase, the achievements of the second phase are lost or depreciated. The old education, the humanist education, the Jesuit education, that was so lost that it was like totally forgotten. There was no living tradition. In music, the Greeks, that we have like notes from the Greeks, like of what their music would look like, or the early medieval stuff. You can find manuscripts, and they just have like scratches. Nothing like our musical notation now. There's no living tradition of Greek music. Nobody ever heard it. Nobody ever heard Roman music. There's a lot of medieval music that was never heard. So if we want to sing it or hear it, we have to make it up again. We have to recover it and try to guess at it. That's something like what is the case with classical education. All of this renewal has kind of started mostly from people who didn't have it, and they're reading books and trying to figure out how this might work. So that's one of the difficulties. Another difficulty is that there have been a number of different ways that people have restarted this kind of education that are not really starting from the same starting point, and people tend to lump all that stuff together as classical education. So one of the early ones was John Henry Newman's The Idea of a University. That would have been in the middle of the 19th century. And then you had Leo XIII said Catholic theology starts with St. Thomas Aquinas. So he started a renewal of the study of St. Thomas Aquinas, and so a renewal of scholasticism. In the early 20th century, people it used to be that you read the ancient books. To read the ancient books, you had to learn the languages. You actually had to learn Latin and Greek so that you could read them in Latin and Greek. Well, in the early 20th century, they said, well, we're not going to do that anymore. People aren't really going to do that, invest the time. So we're going to do great books. We'll read the great books in translation, and we'll discuss them. So that whole discussion method of classes based on great books that I benefited from, that's a very modern and American phenomenon. It's not actually the way things were done. But that's people have had a wonderful experience with that. And so people tend to think, sometimes they'll think classical, that means Socratic, right? That's one way we might think about it. And then, of course, Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning was a very sketchy That is, she just sketched a kind of recovery of the trivium, not the quadrivium, by the way, not the mathematics side, but just the trivium side. She sketched that and adapted it to our subject and kind of our subject divisions. That was not the way it was done before. Not that any of that's bad, that it's new, but it's just a very different way of doing it than it was done in the past, or than the great books model, or than what Cardinal Newman was thinking about, or than scholasticism. So one of the difficulties we face is just that people lump under classical all these really very different ways of educating. That's why we call ourselves the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education. When I started it, people said you should call it the Institute for Catholic Classical Education because that's a fad and that people will pay attention to. They'll really like it. And it's like, well, classical, it's just, I don't even know what people mean by that. And it's just one way of doing things anyway. Liberal education is the idea that all these forms of education, they're trying to get the same thing. And it's different from a technocratic and vocationally oriented education. So liberal education is an education to free, an education that is freeing, and an education that's proper to free men, especially those who don't have to earn a living, if you can. So it's something for its own sake. Another difficulty we have is that we can have a romanticism about the old. We can think the old is great and it's so much better than what's now, and we'll probably never be able to reproduce that. We'll certainly not get any better than that. Well, the old education, even the education of the Jesuits, the education that Christopher Dawson himself received, it was really never Christian. It was done by Christians. It bore fruit for Christians. But Christopher Dawson says, for 2,000 years, so that goes this is the early 19th century, so it goes back before Christ, and it's talking about the Roman and Greek education. For nearly 2,000 years, Europe had been taught in the same school and by the same masters, so that the schoolboy and the undergraduate of the 19th century were still reading the same books and conforming their minds to the same standards, conforming their minds to the same standards as their Roman predecessors 1,800 years before. So it was never Christianized. Now it did a lot of things. It helped produce, some great saintly Jesuit educators, among others. But it wasn't internally thought about as, how should we do this if we're Catholics? And if we're Catholics who have wisdom. Another difficulty is that what replaced classical education was algebra and modern science. So STEM dominates education today. Well, STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Mathematics means algebra. The quadrivium, the ancient mathematics, was not algebra. Do you know who developed algebra? Who is the inventor of algebra? Who is at least the modern inventor of algebra? René Descartes. Have you ever heard of Descartes? For many Catholics who dislike modern thought or think there's real problems with it, Descartes is the bad guy, like the really bad guy. He's the origin of all things evil today. Now, that's an exaggeration. Well, he's the one who developed algebra. So next time your math teachers are trying to get you to study algebra, just say, Descartes invented that. Dr. Seeley said we shouldn't be studying. This is not true, okay? I want to disclaim that right now. But it's not accidental that algebra took over as the way to train the mind. And at the same time, that went hand in hand with a Cartesian philosophy which is a complete rejection and overthrow of scholasticism and ancient forms of wisdom. So one of my great projects is to both recall the quadrivium, make geometry and arithmetic and astronomy and music as a mathematical discipline to make them a living part of the school curriculum, while still not only keeping algebra, but making it the kind of great experience it ought to be. Pray for me. So I think because what replaced it was science and math as Descartes conceived it, that put it in opposition to the humanities side, to the literature and philosophy side. And there's quite a bit of text there in the handout from Descartes. There's a neat little book if you want to read some Descartes and kind of enjoy it. Read the beginning of the Discourse on Method. In the first book, he says, let me tell you about my education. He was educated by the best Jesuits, at the best Jesuit school, or one of the very best in Europe. And he goes through it, and he's a really good writer. He goes through it, and he gives you point by point by point exactly what a Jesuit classical education was. And then he goes through and he says, and it was all useless, point by point by point by point. And he does it in a nice way so that he's not offending people, but really at the heart of it, it's all useless. Therefore, I have to go in an entirely different way. So, so opposition. Coming in for a landing here. Christopher Dawson, so these are the difficulties. We need hope in the face of these difficulties. Christopher Dawson, another quotation from him, shows us the seriousness of the educational problem. The survival of a civilization depends on the continuity of its educational tradition. A common educational system creates a common world of thought with common intellectual values and a common inheritance of knowledge, which it makes a society conscious of its identity and gives it a common memory of its past. Any breach in the continuity of the educational tradition involves a corresponding breach in the continuity of the civilization. So people realize that we are losing our Western civilization, our Christian civilization. It's going away. In my lifetime, I've seen it going away in front of my eyes. And at the heart of that, he says, is the loss of the educational tradition. He also points out, like China, if you do any history of China, China was conquered all the time. Like that Great Wall did no good whatsoever, as far as I can tell. They were always conquered by people from the outside, and yet the Chinese continued, and the civilization continued for thousands of years because their education was the same. They got conquered by barbarians who weren't educated and didn't care about it, and the same people educated, and so Chinese civilization went on. We're in the opposite situation. So we need to have hope in front of this great difficulty. The work you're doing here is not only a source of hope for those who come to visit you, but it's going to contribute to the enrichment of Catholic education. We're forming these new ways of recovering the old in a way that flourishes in these vibrant Catholic communities. We're forming them and we're spreading them. So you're contributing to the hope. And I think we're not just going to hope, I'm not just hoping that Catholic education will survive. I'm not even just hoping that it will thrive. I have great hope that it's going to flourish. And in fact, Catholic education is going to dazzle. In that opening quotation from Dawson, he says, these new forms are going to conquer the world. And that's what we're going to do. Unless we get nuclear bombs dropped on us. But don't worry about that. So I'll close in this way. And we can talk, there's all sorts of things to talk about. And believe me, you know what, actually I've cut out about half of my talk, so thank me. One of the most important things about this is that we're not just looking to the classical education tradition. We're looking to the wisdom and the teaching and the experience of the church. And then going back to the Lord of the Rings. So we should never really lose touch with the Lord of the Rings. There's a wonderful part. One of my favorite parts is when they're in just about to enter Mordor. And Sam and Frodo start talking about stories and the stories they've heard and wondering about stories. And then Sam's like, wow, you know what? We're in the same story still. This is the same story going on, and we are living actors in it. And it's like, oh man, maybe I wonder what it'd be like to hear our story told. And one of the great catastrophic moments of The Lord of the Rings is when Sam wakes up after they're rescued from Mount Doom. And then they have the singer comes forward and he sings of the Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom. And Sam breaks into tears. It's just an amazing moment. And then at the very end of The Lord of the Rings, which I'm going to just read here. Return of the King. Very end of The Lord of the Rings. Now I've got to get my glasses out. I had my eyes replaced, and so I need glasses to read now. So, as Frodo's leaving, and Sam realizes he's leaving, Frodo leaves him the red book of the Westmark. So Frodo actually wrote the story of The Lord of the Rings. And he leaves the story of The Lord of the Rings with Sam. And he says to Sam, you will be mayor, of course, as long as you want to be, and the most famous gardener in history. And you will read things out of the red book and keep alive the memory of the age that is gone, so that people will remember the great danger and so love their beloved land all the more. And that will keep you as busy and as happy as anyone can be as long as your part of the story goes on. And so I'm hopeful that some of us will live to hear to read the story of the great Catholic educational renewal and love and come to love their faith and their church and their schools even more. Thank you very much.